Good morning. Let me start this presentation with an hypothetical situation. A hunter which has been spent almost a complete day following a prey. She is miles far from home and needs to eat something soon. The prey, which is an old antelope or an old deer, finally ends exhausted. The hunter immediately kills the animal. At the moment in which the hunter starts to cut the meat, a predator appears in the distance. It may be a lion or a leopard, but certainly is not a wolf. It may be 1 or 2 miles, and it's approaching. In that moment, it is getting dark. The season is summer. It has not rained in days. The question is this: does it make any sense to assume that every single piece of information of this problem is taken into account by the hunter to decide finally to take some pieces of meat, leave the rest and run away? The hunter does not try to analyze all the potential outputs based on every single detail. It would take her too much time. We know that some hunters made the best decisions because otherwise the human species would have been extinct. We know that we made good decisions because every day we deal with serious risks that compromise our life and we still remain. The traditional rational decision-making method is intractable in practice due to the amount of information and cognitive capacities that would be required in natural scenarios. Live organisms take decisions in other manner, rapidly, effortlessly, and efficiently. This is precisely what we name heuristics. Heuristics are self-consistent cognitive processes that can generate the best outputs when environmental conditions are coupled. They arise with a minimum effort and are applied immediately due to their accessibility. This notion is an evolution of a previous concept, the cognitive bias, introduced in 1974 by Tversky and Kahneman. They describe an alternative decision process which arises due to the cognitive limitations when complex attributes of a problem are substituted by different traits which demand a lower level of cognitive capacities. And by cognitive capacities, they mean memory and processing power. The aim of this work is to give a plausible explanation to the formation of heuristics and the role of the environmental conditions in this process. We use agent-based simulations of decision-making processes, and we adopt an ecocognitive perspective. Lorenzo Magnani proposed to frame heuristics as manipulative abduction processes. This means, and I'm quoting, an extra-theoretical behavior that aims at creating communicable accounts of new experiences to integrate them into previously existing systems of existential and linguistic practices. This frame recognizes the value of empirical personal experiences into the cognition. This is the value of thinking through doing when thinking about doing. The key point is that action provides valuable information that is otherwise inaccessible, and this information is incorporated in the decision making. The complete cognitive process is what we understand as heuristic. Such that cognitive process would be ignorance-preserving if we adopt the computational theory of mind, which sees cognition as the processing of representational states of the world. This is like equate mind with a computational system. In the same paradigm, cognitive capacities are limited to memory and processing. One of the main problems of the theory is the lack of a formalization of common sense. The evidence of truly intentional, ecologically successful decision-making processes that exist in many organisms is left aside. The result is a strict and artificial separation between rational decisions based in utility maximization and any other judgment process. For that reason, we choose a different view to explain heuristics: the enactive approach. Enactivism is founded on the concepts of embodiment, situateness, subjective experience, and sense-making. The identity of a system comes from the operational closure of a network of self-produced and self-maintained processes coupled with the environment. Cognition is defined as an intentional interaction loop with the environment, which can only be possible if the system experiments a precarious condition. A particular aspect of this conception is that, instead using representational states to understand the world, meaning occurs by perceiving. This is quite close to the conception of thinking through doing I mentioned before. Simulated and active agents must be capable of generating its own systemic identity at some level and must have the capacity to actively regulate its ongoing sensory-motor interaction in relation to a viability constraint. It is also necessary that this interaction modify the environment, sometimes irreversibly. Heuristics can be represented within the principle of self-maintaining precarious systems of judgment, actively regulated by a sensory-motor loop, which resemble habits of decision-making. One of the first enacted models of sensory-motor habits was developed by Egbert and Barandarian, the iterant deformable sensory-motor medium, or IDSM. IDSM model has two main features. Sensory-motor states are points of a continuous space representing a history of sensory-motor inputs and motor activity at a mesoscopic level, and a weighted record of sensory-motor states associated with sensory-motor changes, which influence agents' future actions according to their present states. Habits appears as a self-reinforcing repetitive pattern of behavior in the sensory-motor space. Their reinforcement depends on how frequently or recently a pattern of behavior has been performed. To track heuristics, we must to see patterns of decision-making behavior, in particular in dilemmas that jeopardize agents' lives. In this model, agents take decisions about the consumption and expenditure of energy, which is an evident essential variable. In previous works, it has seen that cognitive and biological structures could be deeply integrated, sharing essential variables. In the original model of the iterant medium, the sensory inputs are directly related with modification of motor responses. We modified this part of the model to represent binary decisions instead continuous changes in physical motor component. The sensory inputs are related with intention of performing a specific action. We can put this in terms of the formalization of sensory-motor coupling. We have an environment E, an agent bodily configuration P, an internal state A, a sensory and a motor state S and M respectively. The coupling is reflected in the following equations. In this model, the relation M, which is a function of A, is stochastic. This weakens the lawful closure of the sensory-motor loop, but maintains the deterministic relationship S. The introduction of stochasticity has an advantage for the transparency and understanding of the agent model. It gives the system a physical indeterminacy, which opens a space for the subjectivity of the simulated inactive agent. In these models, agents can fill the viability limits into the sensory inputs, which integrate the recognition of the proximity with this viability limit. Then, the agent feels a binary sensation, that it means that it can feel it or not, and we can make an equivalence of this with hunger. Then, this signal indicates the amount of internal energy, and specifically it says if it's dangerously close to zero or if it is still abundant. This change agrees with a broader definition of an ultra-stable system. In that definition, the separation between parameter changing and the behavior-producing mechanisms is no longer required. Consuming and spending energy is a fundamental part of the development of any living system. The asymmetrical conflict between drives that increase and reduce the energy reservoirs suggests a natural tendency to store as much energy as possible. But we know as a fact that a persistent surplus of energy reservoirs can cause an increase in general and specific disease-related mortality. The construction of a particular habit of food decision making need to involve the environmental conditions, in particular the availability of food. Agents' available information comes from their embodiment and situateness, but it's conceivable to assume that at least part of this information could be transmitted from an ancestral organism as a phenotype or as a cultural context. Within this frame, we build an agent system as follows. The environment consists in a discrete one-dimensional grid with periodic boundary conditions. Every cell has an energetic source. If the source is eaten, the internal energy of the agents who eat is increased by Es, and a new source can grow in the empty cell with a probability Pj. Agent's internal energy is dictated by the following expression. This equation indicates a change in discrete time t. The first term indicates the gain of energy if the agent eats. The next term is the basal metabolism spending, which is composed by a constant rate mb times the maximum level of energy that an agent has reached at that time t. The last term represents the energetic cost of movement if the agent decides to, and when the agent's energy reaches zero, she dies. Notice that x eat and x move are random variables. These are the two decisions that the agent faces. An IDSM controls the volition to eat and to move. An IDSM is composed, in this case, by nodes, which are records of sensory-motor states and sensory-motor velocities. The sensory states only depends on the internal energy and is described by a sigmoidal function as is shown in the graph. The values a and b are such that the function is centered in a threshold value et, which represents a soft limit between two areas of the viability region. The signal is 1 or close to 1 when everything is fine. When the energy is less than the energy threshold, the function quickly changes to 0 to mimic a hunger sensation. The motor components of the state are the probabilities to consume the source of energy and the probability to move. We keep the term motor to refer these probabilities and the term sensory motor to refer the complete sensorial intentional structure that we are employing. The node is weighted according with how close is the present state of the agent with the state on the node, and with how oftenly the agent is in the neighborhood of that state. This equation represents a density of states. New nodes are added to the medium if the node density is less than 1. Omega represents the weighting of the node, and D is a distant factor of the sensory-motor states. Node weights are 0 when the node is created. The updating rule is described in this expression, which represents a degradation factor if the agent does not visit again the node, and a rejuvenation factor when the agent actually visits that state. We employed the same parameters that Ekberg and Barandarian used in his original work. After the node is added to the medium, it remains inactive during 10 time steps. The influence of the medium in the motor states of the agent is represented in this equation. The equation is built as a weighted sum of the influence of every single node, and specifically every single active node, which can be divided in two. A force that pushes the agent away to the node in the direction of the sensory motor velocity, and an attraction force. The motor states, the nodes, and the medium are updated continuously. As actions are performed accordingly the intention of the agent every unit of time, the sensory signal changes in a discrete time. To explore the creation of self-organized habits, we create nodes with random walks in the sensory motor medium. The medium is initialized with a number of nodes, which are originated by a number of random walks in this sensory motor state, starting from a random location. Every new loci is generated adding to every dimension and a small change generated in a uniform distribution. This way of exploring the sensory motor state does not necessarily generate an homogeneous distribution of nodes, and may favor some possible sensory motor habit. However, the assembly of agent systems allow recognizing which of these habits, if formed, are maintained for a longer time given certain environmental conditions. We multiply the influence of the medium by a factor of 3 to counteract the weakening of the sensory action bond due to the stochasticity of the model. We compare two types of agents. The first type of agent uses a randomly initialized IDSM. The second type of agent inherits her IDSM to her descendants, as if the behavioral history could be transmitted to offspring. The number of cells of the environment is 10. The initial internal energy of the agents is fixed in 10, the same as the energy threshold, which divides the sensory input in 2. The constants A and B of the sigmoidal functions are 20 and 2 respectively. The metabolism rate constant is 0.05. The factor of the cost of movement is 0.01. The energy of the sources in the cells is 3. The regeneration probability of an empty cell changes from 0.7 to 1 in steps of 0.1. Every system is followed during 500 time steps. The initial motor states of the agent is 0.5, 0.5, and the medium is initialized with 5,000 nodes from 100 random walks. Agents can have a random medium or can have an inherited one. Every single set of parameters is repeated 25 times, and every simulation produces a record of the motor and sensory dynamic during the lifespan of the agent, and we can identify sensory motor behavior when changes on sensory inputs follow changes on motor states, which follow changes in sensory states. If a set of behavior is sustained and appear recurrently during the lifespan of the agent, it is considered an habit. We also can compare the lifespan of the agent, the time it stays below the energy threshold, and which action is performed. Eating behavior can be categorized as homeostatic if it is a coordinating response to an stimulus which disturbs or jeopardizes the agent existence. The results of this simulation indicates that the probability of regeneration of an empty cell is not linearly related to the eating rate, nor the homeostatic eating rate. The first is calculated as the proportion of time the agent eats during her lifespan. The second is calculated as the proportion of time the agent eats when it is below the energy threshold. Both rates are moderately correlated with a longer lifespan. The table 2 gives some insights on how the probability Pj affects the eating behavior, but the most consistent effects are seen on the moving rate. The movement-weak direct effect on survival of agents disappears for high values of Pj. This is expected as the agent's chances to find food in her current cell increases enough to make the search of food unnecessary. Only in 6 of 100 scenarios, the agent survives 500 generations. The homeostatic eating rates in these cases is around 0.5, but is higher than the global homeostatic eating rate. The motor dynamics can be seen in this figure. In general, the probabilities of eating and moving doesn't change if the values of the energy signal is close or in fact is 1 or 0. When agent's energy go through the threshold ET in both directions, the motor state of the agent changes. For survivor agents, the simultaneous execution of eating and moving increases to the detriment of the static strategies. In these experiments, the medium influence on eating and moving appear to have a fragile coordination. The agents that inherit a medium from ancestors have a longer average lifespan, but there are less survivors. These results suggest that these agents have a less diversified repertoire of habits to face environmental changes, but their means of behavior control, molded by generation, increases their life expectancy. The improvement on lifespan appears at early generations and vanishes until be imperceptible with the most distant descendants. This work is a first step towards an understanding of the creation of high cognitive decision-making mechanisms observed in organisms with subjective meaning. The enactive dynamical approach provides the minimal conditions for a transparent definition of heuristics as something more than an alternative mechanism. Further work needs to be carried out to endogenize some features of the iterant medium, as for example, the sigmoidal sensory signal of the internal energy, which could be replaced by a linear signal subject to evolve over time, and to formalize the stochastic functions on the sensory motor coupling. Thanks for your attention.